Much is said about the Geneva Conventions. I just explained to you that terrorists are not protected under the Geneva Conventions. There was an effort to amend the conventions, the 1949 Protocol 2, when Ronald Reagan was president. And there were parts of the amendment that he liked, but he rejected it. He rejected the second agreement. So the part of the agreement he liked, he recommended, but there was a fatal flaw with the second agreement, so he rejected that. In a letter, January 29, 1987, to the U.S. Senate, Ronald Reagan wrote in part, "While I recommend that the Senate grant advice and consent to this agreement, I have at the same time concluded that the United States cannot ratify a second agreement on the law of armed conflict negotiated during the same period. I am referring to Protocol 1, additional to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which would revise the rules applicable to international armed conflicts. A provision would grant combatant status to irregular forces even if they do not satisfy the traditional requirements to distinguish themselves from the civilian population and otherwise comply with the laws of war. This would endanger civilians among whom terrorists and other irregulars attempt to conceal themselves. These problems are so fundamental in character that they cannot be remedied through reservations, and I therefore have decided not to submit the protocol to the Senate in any form, and I would invite an expression of the sense of the Senate that it shares this view. Finally, the Joint Chiefs of Staff have concluded that a number of the provisions of this protocol are militarily unacceptable. He later says, in fact, we must not and need not give recognition and protection to terrorist groups as a price for progress in humanitarian law. And he goes on later, I believe that these actions are a significant step in defense of traditional humanitarian law and in opposition to the intense efforts of terrorist organizations and their supporters to promote the legitimacy of their aims and practices. The repudiation of Protocol 1 is one additional step at the ideological level so important to terrorist organizations to deny these groups legitimacy as international actors. Ronald Reagan, 22 and a half years ago. And my God, what would he think today if a president of the United States, by executive action, confers constitutional rights on terrorists and brings them into the homeland? So outrageous this is. FDR, never. Lincoln, never. Reagan, never. Obama, yes. Now let's talk a little bit more about Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder. Who is this guy? Well, he's no damn good. Nearly 100 of the remaining detainees at Guantanamo are Yemenis, reflecting that country's refusal to assure security for repatriated Yemenis. Noted that Attorney General nominee Eric Holder is a senior partner with Covington & Burling, a Washington, D.C. law firm which represents 17 Yemenis currently held at Gitmo. And this is what their website said at the time. The firm represents 17 Yemeni nationals and one Pakistani citizen held at Guantanamo Bay. The Supreme Court will soon review the D.C. Circuit's ruling that ordered the dismissal of a number of habeas petitions filed by Guantanamo detainees. Some of our clients are petitioners in the Supreme Court case. We expect to play a substantial role in the briefing. We also plan to petition the Supreme Court to hear our Pakistani client's appeal from the D.C. Circuit's order dismissing his case. Further, we are pursuing relief in the D.C. Circuit under the Detainee Treatment Act of 2005 for all of our clients. On a separate front, we filed amicus briefs and coordinated the amicus effort in Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, in which the Supreme Court in the summer of 2006 invalidated President Bush's military commissions, and in which we have obtained favorable rulings that our clients have rights under the Fifth Amendment and the Geneva Conventions. Holder's law firm, Holder's colleagues, Holder a senior partner, obviously in full agreement. Covington & Burling, Gitmo bar roster, as Malkin wrote, has included some of the most radical detainee advocates. See David Reams, who peeled down to his underwear at a press conference in Yemen to draw attention to his client's plight, and Mark Folkoff, who published a book of detainee poetry and who in the book's intro compared their heroic struggle to the Jews held in concentration camps and Japanese Americans held in internment camps during World War II. The fact that Holder, while Deputy Attorney General, pushed for the release of 16 violent FALN terrorists against the advice of the FBI, the U.S. attorneys who prosecuted them, and the NYPD officers who were maimed by them, suggests that he was perfectly willing to put politics before national security interests. This is the Attorney General. And speaking of the FALN terrorists, in the past, Holder has tried to downplay his role when he was Deputy Attorney General under Bill Clinton. The LA Times, back in January, reported that Holder actively sought to blunt opposition to Clinton's pardon of members of two pro-Puerto Rican independence terrorist groups. The Times wrote, quote, "New interviews and an examination of previously undisclosed documents indicate that Holder played an active role in changing the position of the Justice Department on the commutations. Holder instructed his staff at Justice's Office of Pardon Attorney to effectively replace the department's original report recommending against any commutations, which had been sent to the White House in 1996, with one that favored clemency for at least half the prisoners, according to 3 interviews and documents. The 16 members of the FALN, the Spanish acronym for Armed Forces of National Liberation, and Los Mocheteros, had been convicted in Chicago and Hartford variously of bank robbery, possession of explosives, and participating in a seditious conspiracy. Overall, the two groups have been linked by the FBI to more than 130 bombings, several armed robberies, 6 slayings, and hundreds of injuries. A spokesman for the Obama transition, Nick Shapiro, confirmed that Holder asked for the options memo that preceded the clemency. When Clinton issued the commutations on April 11, 1999, the House and the Senate passed resolutions condemning his decision. Holder was called to testify on the case by the Senate Judiciary Committee, but, invoking Clinton's claim of executive privilege, declined to say whether the Justice Department had changed its position on the commutations. Asked what happened after the 1996 report opposing any commutations, he told the senators there were subsequent communications with the White House in the months after that recommendation. Mr. Holder was crucial in the release of these terrorists, these convicts. Mr. Holder's law firm, where he was a senior partner, has been crucial in undermining our war on terrorism and the security of this nation, relating to their representation of over a dozen of the enemy at Guantanamo Bay. And now Mr. Holder, as Attorney General of the United States, carrying out the wishes of William Ayers' favorite president, has thrown away the tradition and the rule of law set forth in the Constitution, underscored by the Supreme Court, and practiced by Lincoln, FDR, and Ronald Reagan, not to mention George W. Bush, respecting military commissions and the treatment of terrorists. So the next time somebody says to you that the Constitution and our history, the rule of law and justice compel what Obama and Holder are doing, you can tell them, you're a GD liar. You are a liar. And the idea that you would stand up and defend this outrageous behavior, that you would embrace the most extreme elements in this country and their tactics since 9/11 to undermine our nation's security, is a disgrace. And I don't care if you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent. I don't care what your race is, what your religion is, what your sex is. This is a disgrace. They're going to bring them to the Southern District of New York, blocks away from where those 2 towers were attacked and crashed. This president is a disgrace in more ways than I know how to, to describe. This Attorney General is a fraud in more ways than I know how to describe. Anybody that works for this administration at a high level that has an ounce of integrity should resign in protest. Mr. Secretary of Defense, Mr. Director of the CIA, Mr. Director of the FBI, Commander-in-Chief My Foot, he's the commander of the 5th Column.